I want you for a moment to think about, when was the last time you had a conversation about sexuality? Was it with your partner? Was it with a friend? Now, if you work with me, that doesn't count, because that means I'm forcing you to have these conversations daily. You know, sexuality is the one thing as humans that connects us all. It's how we got here, in fact. For me, I believe sexuality, from the womb to the tomb, baby, it's a part of your everyday life. But oftentimes we do not have enough conversations. Dr. Michael Carrera from the Children's Aid Society states that sexuality consists of things that are biological, sociological, psychological, and the spiritual variables that make us who we are. It affects human development and interpersonal relationships. Therefore, we should be having conversations around sexuality on a regular basis. You see, I grew up in Middle America, small town Indiana, in a trailer park. My mother is a lesbian, and I felt love. Growing up as a young person, I was exposed to men who were definitely more feminine than a lot of the women, and women who were more masculine than most. And it was a space of love. My first conversation around sexuality started before I even knew what sexuality was. My mom had me on the softball field with a bunch of her other lesbian friends. She had on a teal shirt. I was probably 4, had a swish on it, and it said DYKE. And I looked at my mother and I said, "Mom, what does dyke mean?" And she looked down at me with great pride and she said, "It's what your mother is." So in my home, love was love, was love, was love. It didn't matter who you loved. But I quickly learned as a young person that in Indiana, talking about the love that I was being raised in was not possible, for fear of Child Protective Services coming and taking me out of the home. For fear that if my mother had been outed, we would lose that beautiful trailer number 13 we lived in, or she could lose her job, which would inevitably happen a few years later. I was innocent. I was also one of very few biracial children in Indiana. And as I grew up, the whispers became louder and louder. The woman who helped raise me in my youngest years, we couldn't call my mom's girlfriend. She had to be her roommate. Because conversations around sexuality and that love is love and that families look different were not being had. Those whispers became murmurs on the playground. They became invitations I didn't receive to slumber parties for birthdays. They became so loud that it started to impact my self-esteem. In fact, according to the Human Rights Commission, 92% of young people who identify as LGBTQ hear homophobic slurs on a regular basis from school, their peers, or on the internet. Now, for me, I heard them, but I tried to fight through it. Didn't always work, and I had really low self-esteem. It got to a point that those whispers became roars. And my freshman year of high school, there was a young man in my biology class who continually harassed me, calling me a dyke, telling me I probably performed sex acts on my mother, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I decided to stand up for myself. Well, no teachers were coming to my aid, and I knew that if I didn't do something, the bullying would continue. That day ended with me in jail, a broken eye socket, and a school suspension. My high school experience would never be the same. My self-esteem would never be the same. because there was not anyone having conversations about sexuality, letting me know that what I was standing up for was not just my mother, but for all people. A year later, I met an athlete from a neighboring school, and he invited me to a party. And I was so excited to go. I was like, now I'm going to be accepted by my peers. Because again, being a biracial woman in the 80s, well, I stood out. But I stood out as exotic, and I've had the same body type since I was 12. I stood out as sexy, often hypersexualized. And when this boy invited me to this party, I said, yes, finally I'll be popular. Now, I had a curfew, so I lied to my mom and said I was staying at a friend's house. Some of you have done that, I'm sure. So I could stay out later. And at the party, I felt so awesome. The drinks were flowing, people were laughing, and I was accepted. Nobody was talking about what my mom was doing, who she loved, or why my mother had a roommate. However, that party did not end the way it began, full of joy and excitement. It ended the next morning with me feeling violated, with me recognizing that although the young man meant no malice or ill intent, what had transpired that night was wrong. I realized I had been sexually assaulted. From there, my self-esteem dipped lower and lower. I didn't know I was the only one. I hadn't been given the education or the language to have conversations to advocate for myself. According to RAINN, 1 in 5 young women will be sexually assaulted before 18. And 1 in 20 young men will also experience sexual assault before 18. So, high school was a blur. I started to become a recluse. I stopped playing sports. I stopped hanging out with friends. And before you know it, graduation came and went. And all I wanted to do was get out of Indiana. And one day, a woman said, "You want to make some fast money? I can get you a job at this club I work at, dancing." Now, it wasn't go-go dancing, y'all. It was exotic dancing. And as an 18-year-old woman of color with low education, little skills, but had always been told she was sexy, I thought, this is my way out. So I got up on that pole at 18, and I thought, I'm ready for this. I'm a smart girl, not knowing all the lessons that I would learn at that strip club. Not recognizing that this would be the entry of me understanding that sexuality is so huge. I learned about polyamory. I learned about bisexuality. I learned that a woman's body is her body, and what she chooses to do with it is not my business. She should have the right to do with her body what she wants, because her body is her choice, and her choice is her voice. I remember a house mom at the club telling me, you know, the hardest step is not getting on the stage, but rather getting off. I spent 7 years around a pole, and I am not ashamed of it. In fact, I'm proud of it, because at that club, I learned to have my own voice. I learned how to speak up, and I finally got the words to tell a friend I'd been sexually assaulted that night my sophomore year. And when I told my friend this story, an echoing story came back at me. So then I said, let me tell another friend. And when I told another friend, another story similar to mine came back. Then I started to get the confidence to tell a lot of people my experience of sexual assault, and I was met with an avalanche of stories that echoed my own. And it was then that I realized something had to be done. So I took that step off the stage and I went to college. And I got my master's degree in human development. And for the last 10 years, I've been working in sexual and reproductive justice. Whether it was sex education, whether it was protesting, whether it was working at a battered women's shelter, I have put in my time. And what has come up is that we are not normalizing conversations around sexuality. And that if we could start to normalize these conversations, we could change the world, one sexuality conversation at a time. And I know this is true because recently I was walking around in Harlem and I had someone stop me who sees me out at social events, and it doesn't matter where I'm at. I'm gonna talk about sexuality from a crack house to the White House. I'm ready to learn you something. Happy hours to high school classes. It didn't matter. And this man stopped me on the street and he said, Michelle, you have to keep doing what you're doing. I know you make people uncomfortable when you're out at social events and you talk about trans rights, or you talk about the need for sex education, or the importance of understanding consent. But Michelle, the other night I was with my guys from college and I told them about you. I told them what you do, what you talk about, and it led us to a 2-hour conversation, a painful conversation at that. One that was difficult for us to have because we were able to finally see that everything we had been taught about dating women, mating with women, was predatorial. We came together and realized that our behavior in college probably hurt some people. And although it was an uncomfortable conversation, we realized that we have to change how we teach our children to create change for all. And in that, I recognized that it does not matter where these conversations happen. If we want to get to a world where we realize sexual and reproductive justice, which is actualized when all people have the rights to information, education, and access to care to make decisions about their bodies, their gender expression, their sexual orientation, and their reproduction. To have a child, to not have a child, how to bring that child into the world, and have the social support systems to raise that child. It takes one simple conversation about sexuality. We plant the seed, that seed will grow roots, that tree will grow, and it will bear fruit that will live beyond our own footprints to make the world a more equitable place for the next generation. So it is my hope that in this conversation, you are motivated to do a few things. One, lean in the next time you hear someone having a conversation, and lean in to listen. Listen to learn, not to respond. Two, educate yourself. Education is empowering. Learn about the founders of the reproductive justice movement, sistersong.org, or you can go to repoblueprint.org to find out what types of legislation we need to create more equitable spaces. And then I call you to call your legislators and you ask them, what legislation do you stand for that will help remove sexual and reproductive inequalities in this district? If you are a parent, I ask you, call your school. Call your child's school. At the PTA meeting, ask them, what sexual and reproductive education programming are we implementing? As I stand on this stage, I am no longer the future, but the past. But if we start having these conversations now, we can build a better tomorrow for the young people who are living today. Thank you very much.